Morning and happy Tuesday. Welcome to our September edition of our Solution for Success. As you know, we run this every month on the third Tuesday of each month. So today's subject, which comes up a lot, is what do we do with our file server? So we are here to provide you information on what you should know and how to prepare. Uh, Today's session, I'm run this with my colleague, Jonathan Hamilton. And I'm going to go through our profile in case you need more information if you have not met us before. So again, just a quick couple of pages on the Point Alliance. And are you ready to retire your file server, which most people are, which app and when, migration approaches, meta tag and directory structure, best practices, data sensitivity and retention. As some of you know me, my name is John Zare. I'm a CEO at the Point Alliance. And if you like to connect with me on the LinkedIn, you can scan that QR code. Today with me is Jonathan Hamilton, our president at Point Alliance. And again, if you need to connect with him as well, he will be giving us a detailed walkthrough of what we should watch and all the best practices. So thank you so much, Jonathan, for your time today. And a little bit about Point Alliance. We are a Microsoft solution partner with a security and modern work designation. We are very proud of that. Our team is 100% Microsoft certified, and they work very hard to maintain that certification. You can find additional information about Point Alliance, of course, at our website /company profile. That's it. I will hand it to Jonathan Hamilton.
Thank you, John. Yeah, so this is a great topic. We've been doing a lot of work with our clients in this space, and again, just wanted to share some of those learnings with you, some things to think about. John, I'll keep a close eye on the chat with questions, so feel free to jump in and ask any questions as we go along. But are you ready to retire your file server? I think most people would say yes, if they have not already done so. Many of our clients and many customers out there, I think, find it quite easy to get to Microsoft 365 and perhaps migrate their mail. There's tools to do that, relatively straightforward. Not a lot is changing other than your infrastructure is moving up into the cloud and your directory is moving up into the cloud. So, not significant change for users. They're still using their Outlook. It's easy, or relatively easy. And then one of the next stages then is, what about your file server? And some people may tell you that that's, just as easy as moving your mail. There are tools from Microsoft. There are third-party tools for you to just pick up and move everything that you've got on your file server up into a SharePoint site, and you keep the same folders and subfolder structure and the same security, and away you go. But, really, we're here to tell you that you should take a little more time and put a little more forethought into this migration process. There are lots of benefits to being up in the cloud. But we're going to walk you through in about 20 slides or so some of the things to think about, as opposed to just picking up what you may have accumulated over the last 20 plus years on your file server in the various map drives. And again, things that you may want to think about as you move up into Microsoft's cloud. So I'm going to assume that most of you know at least a base level of Teams and SharePoint and OneDrive. Again, the underlying technology of all of them from a file storage perspective is SharePoint. Again, presented to you in a slightly different way with different security options, but a lot of that functionality is the same. So moving to the cloud, again, doesn't just allow you to pick up and move folders and subfolders, but it allows you additional flexibility in storage, potentially more storage than you've currently got on premise. Again, much like moving to the cloud with any of your applications and platforms, eliminating the need for hardware upgrades, maintenance, and some of the things that you're used to doing on server refreshes and hardware upgrades through time. Again, data security is extremely important as we look at what you're doing on your file server and looking at what you can do up in the Microsoft cloud. You know, summarizing sort of what we've got on this slide, again, we've got higher levels of security around data encryption, multi-factor authentication, again, advanced threat protection. And what we would tell you is from a security perspective, and we'll go into this on a later slide, you know, it is a chance for you to review all of your files and your data and what's been going on, because you probably are going to be a little surprised that, you know, the root folder security has been set at some point a long time ago, and then within that root folder, you've got all sorts of hierarchical subfolders that may have different security files that have been shared and security that's been added to specific subfolders or files. And we would, you know, challenge business users and organizations to review what they've been doing and see what's really necessary. We know there's probably been a reason for the security that's been implemented in the past at the file server level, but in moving to the cloud, you know, we would recommend that you're keeping the security, if possible, at a SharePoint site level, at a document library level, and we'd get away from that file folder and file level security, which again, most organizations can live with. It simplifies what you're doing. You make it certainly much more group-based than individual-based. So when individuals are joining the organization or leaving the organization, it's much easier to remove them from groups or add them to groups as opposed to figuring out, oh, John joined the finance team. We've got to add him in 28 different individual places for him to get access to the information he needs to, as opposed to adding John to, you know, 3 or 4 groups, and that propagates around the environment. So just a little bit on security. So I think we're good there. So again, I had mentioned earlier having sort of a base level understanding of OneDrive, Teams, and SharePoint, and that SharePoint is really the document management engine underlying all of these, with content being provided to you in a slightly different interface. But, you know, a way to think about these 3 different platforms or how you're going to migrate that data from your file server would be OneDrive is, you know, your personal drive. So a lot of people on a file server will have a U drive or a P drive that's mapped for each individual, and that's been given to them to work with documents on their own. So OneDrive certainly is that. It's a lot more than that, and we'll go into that. But think of, you know, the content that we're going to migrate into OneDrive is the content that you're working on as an individual. Me and my team, and your team could be a department. It could be a project team. It could be a cross-departmental team, but that's where we use Microsoft Teams. And again, a lot of the features and functions that come with it, the conversations and the chats, the collaboration, the group calendaring, the other things that we can sort of merge together that are going to assist us with that collaborative approach to document creation and document management. And then finally, SharePoint and the wider organization. So, you know, many organizations are leveraging SharePoint for content that may be managed by certain individuals or groups, but viewable to everyone. And so, you know, one of the main distinctions between Teams and SharePoint is certainly, and we mentioned security on the previous slide, you know, anyone that's a member of a team has full access to that content, and they're meant to have full access. So they can create, they can edit, they can delete, they can do all these things, which again works very well in some use cases. In other use cases, you don't want that same level of security for everybody. You may want certain groups of individuals, again, to be able to create and edit, with a much wider audience being able to view that content. And as soon as you get into that sort of granularity of security, that's going to point you towards SharePoint. So as soon as you say, hey, this group of people that should have access to the content need different types of access, that's not going to work well in the Teams environment. That's going to be something that you're going to put into SharePoint. So, it's important to understand this as you map your content from your file server and where it's going to go. It's also very important to be able to explain and articulate this to your business users, because as they get up into the Microsoft cloud, again, we don't want them to be lost, and we don't want them to not know where to go to find things, because we now do have different interfaces to this content. If we open SharePoint, if we open Teams, again, a very robust search in Microsoft 365 that's going to help them find this information. But what our goal is to be able to set up, and we'll get into this in a few slides, set up the proper structure that's easily understood from a naming convention perspective and from training to the end users. And as long as they put those documents or that content in the right place, the right security is going to get wrapped around it. So don't make the user think, oh, I'm creating this document. It should be my department, so I'm in IT, so IT should have access, and I want somebody in legal to have access, and maybe somebody else. We want to get away from them sort of thinking that way and have set up the necessary Teams or SharePoint sites, or maybe it is folders that have the right security access with the right groups, and by putting that document in the right place, the right people are going to have access. And then, to extend that one step further, we certainly have the share functionality as well. So when we want to extend beyond the structure that we've set up, we can leverage share. So let's look at each of these platforms in a little more specifics. And when we're migrating to them, what may be involved or some of the considerations that we might want to think about. So as I mentioned earlier, OneDrive is your personal drive. That's not to say that you're the only one who's going to have access to content in your OneDrive. You may decide to share that content out of your OneDrive with other people internal to the organization, or maybe even externally. Certainly lots of our clients from a security perspective have said, listen, if it's going into SharePoint, SharePoint is going to be our sensitive corporate data. We're not going to let people share things out of there because we don't want them to make mistakes and overshare. If you want to share externally with individuals, then we're going to use Teams, and we're going to have collaborative external teams, or we're going to have a link into OneDrive so that you're sharing from that location. But again, let's think of OneDrive as your personal content. So if we look at some of the process steps, clean up your personal drive. Let's have a look at the U drive or the P drive. Let's set some parameters as to what we're keeping. And again, when we say personal, that can take on multiple meanings as well. This doesn't necessarily mean, personal, like, your personal income taxes and pictures from your birthday party and things like that. This means personal corporate, because this is going into the corporate tenant. And so we should be mindful of this. And there may be some refresher training for users as to what they're working on and what they're storing in their OneDrive. Again, we can set up their OneDrive, sync the personal drive to OneDrive, or use the Microsoft migration tool as well. We've got a few different approaches there. One of the things that you also need to be mindful of is that individuals may have their own personal OneDrives. And so this is something that you need to think about and look at as you're setting this environment up as well. So I may have set up, let's say, a personal OneDrive with my Hotmail account, and I've linked to that through my work computer. We're now setting up corporate OneDrive. So again, we've got to be mindful of, which OneDrives are syncing and what is going on in the background. And there may be some reconfiguration that's needed. Again, a small plug for Intune and Endpoint Manager. If you've enrolled your devices, again, you can do a lot of this management and roll out through that. But that's for another topic and another day. Wait for the sync to complete. So again, the synchronization process is going to sync either full documents down to your computer, or it's going to sync stub documents. So there's some OneDrive configuration there, and you can decide sort of from a corporate perspective, what are we going to sync by default and what's coming offline for individuals. Again, the most common would be, your desktop, your documents, and your pictures would be default settings. What it also gives you is, a couple other benefits. One, it's giving you offline access to this content. So if you are not connected to the internet, you can always open your OneDrive. It's a virtual drive where we've synced this information. You can update documents the next time we connect to the internet. We're going to sync back up to OneDrive. Again, I can access that OneDrive content on my laptop, on my phone, or on any other computer that I'm connected to the internet, because I have access to M365 and OneDrive. So again, we're going to verify that migration. We're going to make sure that things are set up properly. We're going to update any links and references and communicate to our users as to the completion of this process. So, the OneDrive migration, I would say, of the three components here is probably the simplest. Again, it's more about cleaning up and making sure we're migrating the right sort of corporate personal content up into OneDrive and making sure that OneDrive is configured properly on everyone's PC. And then the last aspect, I would say, that sort of brings some of these things together from a OneDrive perspective is you can have shortcuts coming from your SharePoint sites and your Microsoft Teams into your OneDrive. Again, we're not going to go into great detail about that today, but we can link those things, which is very useful if you need to be interacting with files on your desktop. So let's say you need the full Adobe client, or we are annotating documents or merging documents together. We're redacting documents, uploading them or downloading them from different third-party websites. Again, OneDrive can be our conduit to SharePoint and Teams sites, so that those individuals familiar with using File Explorer can continue to use that as an interface for some of their business processes. So looking at the Teams migration, again, the Teams migration and the SharePoint migration are somewhat similar. Again, we certainly understand, or let's make sure that everybody's clear that really in the background, this is going to a SharePoint site. A Teams migration is going to take it to a SharePoint Teams site specifically. And again, we can leverage channels within Teams for slightly different levels of security. So when I mentioned earlier, hey, if your scenario or your use case is we want different people with read and different people with edit access, you should go to SharePoint. Definitely a true fact. If we have separate smaller groups within a larger team, again, we can migrate that content to private channels. What happens actually in the background there, as some of you may be aware, is that a private channel will spin off another SharePoint site, which has different security to it, but again, presents that content to you in the Teams interface as you're accustomed to seeing the team and opening up the team and seeing different channels that may be public or private. A public channel in Teams is really just a folder in the document library. A private channel is a separate SharePoint site. So again, identify the files and folders that we want to migrate to Teams, set up the Teams site, plan the migration, migrate the content, validate and train users. So again, are we going to use channels? Are they public channels or private channels? And again, let's be aware that whichever requirement we have, that the users we're going to give access to this content are going to have full edit, create, delete access. But then we get all the benefits of Teams, again, as I mentioned earlier, the chat, the group calendaring, all sorts of things. So that's the Teams part. Moving to the SharePoint migration, again, very similar to Teams, that we're going to plan this. We're going to prepare and clean up the file server with all the content. Again, the reality is, and everybody thinks this is a great time to clean up the content. It is, depending on how long you've had your file server in existence. The reality of how much time people are going to actually spend tidying up that content. And, most people are going to say, well, I do have a regular job that I've got to do, and I'm not going to spend weeks and months sifting through all these old documents. So you're going to have to make a judgment call at some point. You don't really want to take everything that you may have accumulated over that time if people have not been archiving and not been cleaning up their folders and subfolders. But you will need to put a stake in the sand and say, listen, we've done or given you as much time as we think is reasonable. We're going to move what's there, archive, maybe based on date. So maybe we're going to take everything that's, and we can set parameters like this, everything that's been created or modified in the last 2 years, we're going to migrate. Things beyond that, we're going to archive to a different platform. But again, what's important to be mindful of with this, and I think we touch on it on a future slide, is we want to set up the SharePoint and the Teams environment with the new security. So when we do these migrations, again, we're not moving content with the security, the legacy security that it's coming with. We're stripping it of the security. We're migrating it into the necessary SharePoint sites, the SharePoint libraries that have new groups associated to it. And it's very much group-based and easier to manage and maintain. So that is important to know. All right, I'm being mindful of time, so I'll pick up the pace a little bit. Meta tags and directory structure. So we've touched on directory structure a little bit. Meta tags is a way for us to tag documents. Again, this can act in or can accompany folders and subfolders. In some cases, it can replace folders and subfolders. Again, the balance there that I would tell you is, you may be moving content that goes 5 or 6 subfolders deep, and you've got a year subfolder and a client subfolder and a document type subfolder and all these sorts of things. And Microsoft would definitely sort of recommend pushing you towards a flatter structure. But at the same time, users are going to only add a handful of meta tags to your data. So if you think they're going to go in and tag a document 7 different ways every time they're going to drop a document into a SharePoint library, that's probably going to become cumbersome, and they'll probably veer away from doing that. So I'd say there's a balance there that people would add a couple of tags. So tags, as I mentioned, can act in accompaniment with files and subfolders or can replace them. And again, your directory structure, as we talk about folders and subfolders, we should just look at, okay, how are we splitting this content into sites, into document libraries? And a lot of times that's going to be based on the security requirements. So if the security requirements are the same, we can keep that content together, leverage folders, subfolders, meta tags, document sets. We won't get into that today, but again, a document set is sort of a higher level folder that has metadata associated with it. So there's different ways, certainly online, that we can deal with that content to make it easier for users. So if we look at a high level to some of the best practices that we've talked about today, again, review and clean up your file server files. Sometimes easier said than done, most times easier said than done. Decide what your archive rules are going to be and how much content we're going to migrate. Establish who the content owners are of those root folders on your file server. Again, some of them are going to be obvious and they're going to be department-based, HR, finance, operations, IT, those sorts of things. Other ones may not be so obvious and may change as we get to the subfolders, but we've got to establish who those content owners are and who we're going to work with to review that content and the new security structure that's going to be set up in the cloud. Determine those security requirements we just mentioned. The creation of new sites and library. So when we look at the structure, what are we going to set up based on the security requirements? How many sites do we need? How many libraries? We can have multiple libraries within a single site that may have different security. Use the Microsoft migration tool to map and migrate files and folders to SharePoint, Teams, and OneDrive. Again, this is a free tool from Microsoft and can accommodate most of these migrations. There are other third-party tools like ShareGate and things like that, depending on the complexity of the migration. Again, we would see clients leverage ShareGate a lot more from SharePoint on-premise migrations or tenant-to-tenant migrations, but you may use it in a file server migration as well. Train your users. So again, making sure people understand what has been set up, how they use the tools, how you can create new documents right from within Microsoft 365 as opposed to opening up Microsoft Word, saving it to your desktop, then putting it where you want it to go. Also, another rule of thumb that we mentioned to clients is that you really shouldn't be sending file attachments internally anymore, right? We should be sharing links to those documents with all the benefits of versioning. And so files shouldn't be flying around the organization with my initials and a date on them, and then John adds his initials and a new date and maybe another status. We've got all those features and functions built right into the platform, so we can just share links and we can collaborate on those files. And finally, we can leverage some enhanced SharePoint features. And I think in the last sort of 2 minutes, we've got a couple of features that we touch on. Data sensitivity and retention. So again, this can be a whole session unto itself. But once we get into Microsoft 365 and the OneDrive, Teams, and SharePoint environment, we can add data sensitivity labeling depending on our license entitlements. Examples of that would be internal, confidential, strictly confidential. This helps us categorize the content. It can help us track that content if we're concerned about sensitive data being emailed out or being shared out to external parties. And finally, we can encrypt based on those sensitivity labels as well. So if we've got highly sensitive intellectual property or R&D information, we may want to encrypt some of those files and sort of take it to a next level. Secondly, we've got data retention labeling. Again, another type of label. So these are all separate. We've got metadata labels, data sensitivity labels, and data retention labels. So just to keep that sort of straight. And we can marry that up to our retention schedules and our retention compliance as it pertains to how long we've got to keep data around and when we archive that data. So again, a few higher end features that we've got, different ways to access some of that and report on it with Microsoft Purview and other tools, but just want to give you a sense of that. I think that may be our last slide before.
Yes, thank you so much, Jonathan. That was lots of information, and I know this was only 30 minutes. This is just to kind of get the ideas going, and if you need any more information, any what we discussed today, of course, you can reach out to us, and we'd be happy to have a more extensive discussion and chat on that. I don't see any question here on our question board. I appreciate you all being here. Thank you. Just as I mentioned earlier, our third Tuesday of each month, we have our upcoming solution for success. We do have one exception, and we are excited about the October 1st. We have a 1-hour session on the Cybersecurity Awareness Month. This is the webinars that we do for our clients, for the staff. So I really encourage you to attend this and share with others. It's going to be jam-packed with all the tips and tricks to make sure security is not something you can take lightly, and is not a 9-to-5 thing. We need to worry about it even with our own personal side outside of the work. So please register and attend that session, and you can find all our upcoming events at pointalliance.com/events. That said, again, I don't see any question. If you find this webinar useful and informative, please scan this QR code and leave us a review on the Google review. We always appreciate those reviews, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event on the October 1st. Thank you all.
One last point, John. We will be sending the link to the recording, so everyone will get the recording of this presentation.
That's correct. Yes. All right. Thank you, everyone. You have a wonderful day and a week, and hope to see you soon.